Gibbet Hill by Bram Stoker. When I left the Royal Huts Inn to visit the Devil's Punch Bowl and Gibbet Hill, I passed along the new high road between London and Portsmouth until I came to the edge of the Punch Bowl, where I feasted my eyes on its beauty. The fog, which had been heavy in London, extended even to Hazelmere and hung in the valleys so that the tops of the Surrey hills rose like islands from a sea of mist. And in the brilliant sunshine, which glorified these upper levels, it softened and mellowed all the wide expanse of hill and dale and down which ranged between me and the southern coast. The hill gave steeply on all sides, save the northwest, where the circular valley opened to the plain below. And all the summer tints were chastened and mellowed here. The full colours which the sunshine had glorified had faded into the sere of autumn. The pinks and purples of the heather were changed to a brown, which only suggested a faded colour to warm its tone. The bracken was of rich amber and faded yellow, and the myriads of grasses and wildflowers had donned their winter garb, the hues of decay. And yet, through all this rich mass of autumn tints, the broom, untouched as yet by the frost, sent an emerald flash. The green bushes which fringed the tiny stream running through the valley seemed of supernatural vividness, and the dark green of the pines which covered the western slope and ran down into the valley seemed to assert in some positive way the right of nature to maintain her own colour despite all influences. Away to the north and west, past the spurs and shoulders of the hill, the woods and valleys, the copses and villages and hills and ridges ranged in endless succession. And it was only after a long, long pause that I turned from drinking in the beauty of the scene. Here at last, I said to myself, here at last, the soul of man is elevated and the evil of our hearts is lulled. But as I turned, I started because, as if by irony of fate, there beside me was a grim memorial of man's wickedness and lust for blood, a tombstone by the roadside, marking the spot where a century before a poor seaman trudging on his way from Portsmouth had been murdered. But not the stone only was of interest, because by it were three figures which would have arrested attention anywhere. Either they're only children, but, well, of types that were not at all common. Two of them were young Indian girls, of an age which, by the slower development of English girlhood, would be sometime between 13 or 14 years. Being, however, of Eastern birth, they were probably much younger. They stood one on each side of the memorial stone, looking almost like heraldic supporters, as each, with a slim brown hand resting on an elbow of the stone, leaned her face on the hand, while looking at me gravely with large, dark, fathomless eyes. I mean, they were both very pretty of their type, and their slim, girlish figures were draped in black of some shimmering material, with a wide belt of the same stuff around the waist, and some kind of a dark material wound about the head. The third of the group was a boy of some 10 years old, with hair of spun gold, eyes like blue porcelain, and a winning smile upon his rosy face. I mean, one might designate him indifferently as a Cupid or an angel. He was dressed in a sort of dark, blood-coloured tunic. I mean, for a few seconds, I stood looking at this group, and they regarded me steadfastly without the slightest movement. And then I spoke to them, making some remark about the beauty of the scene. One of the girls said, tapping the stone with her hand as she spoke, "Can you tell us anything about this stone, sir? We are strangers." "Well," I said, "I'm a stranger here myself, but I I think that we can find an explanation here. And I proceeded to read the inscription, which is on both sides of the stone. Now, when I reached the word murder, they all looked at each other and then at me and shuddered. And then, strange to say, they followed the shudder with a smile. Now, I thought they might be frightened, and so I hastened to add, don't let this disturb you, children. It all happened 100 years ago when the country was very different from what it is now. And one of the girls said in a low voice, whose tones were peculiarly penetrating, I hope not. I trust not. And then the little boy looked up at me with a laugh, and he said, I suppose if there was a murder now, someone would be stuck up on Gibbet Hill. Hello, young man, I said. You seem to know all about it. Well, I'm going up to the hilltop to see the memorial cross. Will you come and see where they put the murderer? Oh, with pleasure, he said, and he lifted his cap in acknowledgement of my invitation, and the girls bowed too. And so we all moved up the hill together. Now, as we went, I noticed that the boy had one of his hands tightly clenched. What have you got there? I said to him. These, he said, and opening his hand, he showed me a crumpled mass of earthworms, wriggling in their sudden freedom. I love worms, he went on. Look, see, they wriggle so, and you can pull them out long. And he illustrated this latter fact. Oh, hey, poor worms, I said. Come on, why not let them go? They'd much rather be in the ground. Shan't, was his only reply, and he shoved them into the folds of his tunic. Now, there were a lot of other people up at the cross when we reached the top of Gibbet Hill. It's a favourite picnicking spot. And amongst these strangers, my fancy was chiefly taken by a lady and gentleman who I dubbed the honeymoon couple. But you see, I soon became so absorbed by the beautiful view that lay stretched before me that I quite forgot about everybody else for some time. And then I remembered the children, and I looked around for them, but they'd quite disappeared. Not a sight of them anywhere. Now, my departure from London had been early, and the walk from Hazelmere in the blazing October sun had quite tired me. And so after a while, when I'd been around the summit of the Head, I took my way to a deep, shady grove of hazel and beech with tall pines rising all about it. Here there was the very perfection of autumn fullness. And with a blissful feeling of content, I stretched myself out on the grass and lost my thoughts and consciousness in the interlaced branches above me. Now, how long I slept for, I don't know, but it must have been a good while, because I awoke thoroughly refreshed as to brain, and with that half aching sense of cramped muscles which comes after a long period of unchanged attitude. And that there was too over me that mysterious sense of elapsed time which tells philosophers that our thought is continuous in some form or another. But you see, there was no sense of duty omitted, no sense of coming work, which in such cases destroys the charm of awaking. I knew that there was ample time before me, and that I might muse on unchecked, revel to my heart's content in the sense of freedom, and enjoy the freshness and the purity of the air. And so I lay on my back with my hands under my head, looking up into the branches and watching the gleams of light struggle through the tracery of leaf and branch. Now, that there was in the air the same faint hum of varied sounds which had first lulled me to sleep, but somehow the volume was richer than before. It was more full and satisfying to the ear, and with a special significance, as if not only all nature was speaking, but that there was one voice amongst the myriad more potent than the rest. I listened with growing interest, and the sound seemed now to take on a more definite place amongst nature's harmonies. And it wasn't as if it grew in loudness, but merely as if the vibrations accumulated coming in waves more quickly than they could die away. And then gradually, all the other noises seemed to die away. And I heard now only this one sound. Seemed to be getting closer and closer. And I began now to distinguish it more clearly until I realized that its source was separated from me by only a score of yards. And then I began to be able to analyze it. In general effect, it was like a sort of musical, muffled corncrake. A corncrake in a whisper, but with some subtle prevailing sweetness of almost irresistible attraction. Presently I raised my head from the bracken where I lay, and I looked towards the sound, and to my surprise, in an open dell, where the light fell through a break in the trees, were those children. The two girls seated and the little boy standing between them. One of the girls held in her left hand something which looked like a set of Pandean pipes made of thin canes, and across this she drew something attached to the fingers of the right hand, which made the bass of the strange corncrake sound that I've tried to describe. The other girl held a shell with strings across it, which she touched lightly, and the boy had a sort of a reed flute, which gave forth a peculiarly long, sweet note which blended into the mass of music. And then the girls began a sort of a chant of strange sweetness, but very, very faint. They were all three of them looking well to one side of me, but now, by and by, the girls stood up alongside the boy, and all three began turning slowly in a complete circle, as though seeking in every direction around them. As they began to face in my direction, I sank back into the bracken so that they might not see me, because this affair had begun to really absorb my interest. A very short time elapsed, however, before my attention was diverted from them, and not at all in a pleasant way. Hearing a stir and a rustle among the dead leaves beside me, I looked round and I almost jumped to my feet, because there, close by and approaching closer, was a large snake, a blindworm. It came straight towards me and actually passed over my feet. Now, I didn't stir, and it went on, heeding me no more than if I had been a log of wood. It wriggled away towards the children in the sunlit glade. It was evidently attracted by this strange music. And as this was my first experience of serpent charming, my interest grew even more, and I watched the little party more closely than ever. The children went on with their music, and the snake approached them closer and closer, till it stopped at the boy's feet, and then, curling itself into a spiral, it raised its head and began to hiss. The boy looked down at it, and the girls turned their eyes towards him, but the music didn't stop for a moment. In fact, the music grew quicker. The snake now twined itself around the lad's ankle and began to climb up his body, wriggling round his leg and thigh. Up and up it went until it crawled along the arm that held the flute, and then suddenly the music stopped, and the boy stretched out his arm with the snake wound around it. His hand was stretched out, wide open, the palm upwards, while the snake remained perfectly still around his arm, as though it was transformed to stone. And now the girls took hands and began to circle around the boy, uttering a low, whispering chant. I mean, like the earlier one, but this time in a minor key. This went on for for 2 or 3 minutes, during which the boy remained perfectly still, his arm extended and his blue eyes fixed on the snake. The latter now raised its head slightly and seemed to follow with it the movement of the circling girls. Now they continued round and round, the snake's movements becoming more and more pronounced with each revolution, until presently it was turning like a firework around the boy's arm. Gradually, the motion of the girls got slower, and that of the snake correspondingly less, until presently the girls' movements and the low croning music, which had never stopped, died away altogether, and the snake hung, a dead mass, as limp as a piece of string, across the boy's hand. Now he never moved, but the girls now let go of each other's hands, and one of them, who had stopped just in front of the boy, took the snake by its head and tail and seemed to gently pull it straight. And when she let it go again, it lay across the boy's hand, as stiff as a piece of wood. Now, in fact, there was nothing uncanny about this, because it reminded me of a man that I had once seen in a cataleptic fit, whose body retained any position into which it was put, no matter how grotesque or how uncomfortable it strained. But you see, with strange curiosity, I awaited the next development. The boy continued impassive, his hand still stretched out with the snake resting across it. The girls stood a little in front of him now, on either side, his hand midway between them, and then began some questioning between them in a language which I presume to be some form of Indian, which I did not at all understand. Now, both voices were sweet, with a peculiar penetrating power, but one of them I seemed instinctively to fear, although it was, in fact, the sweeter and softer of the two. Somehow, and the idea was quite spontaneous, but somehow it was suggestive to me of murder. From the tones and inflections of the questions, I gathered that they were asking questions, and this was shortly confirmed in a strange way, because the answers were given by the rigid snake. When each girl had spoken, and they suggested a choice between positive and negative in their tones, the snake would slowly turn around like the needle of a compass and point its head towards either one. Now, the sweeter voice seemed to be the positive, and the other the negative in the inquiries. And in all the earlier questions, the snake, after turning slowly round, remained with its head towards the negative. Now, this first seemed to disturb and then annoy the positive inquirer, and her voice grew more deadly sweet and penetrating till it made me shudder again. And then she seemed to get more and more enraged, because her eyes gleamed with a dark, unholy light, and at last came her question in a keen, thrilling whisper. For the answer, the snake now spun around quicker and quicker than before, and suddenly came to a dead stop in front of the other girl. The disappointed one gave a single fierce, short, sharp sound like a dog's bark, while a look of deadly malice swept across her face, and then that passed swiftly away, leaving it as serene as before. And at the same instant, the rigidity of the snake collapsed, and it hung for an instant, as limp as before, and then slipped to the ground and lay in a heap without motion, as if dead. The boy started, as though from sleep to waking, and suddenly began to laugh. And the girls joined in the cachinnation, and in an instant the glade, which had seemed so weird, grew instinct with the laughter of children, as they chased each other into the recesses of the wood and disappeared from view. Well, when I rose from the bracken where I lay, I could hardly believe what I'd seen. I thought I must have been asleep and dreamt it all, but no. There lay the snake, seemingly dead before me, as palpable evidence that I had beheld a reality. Now, the sun was far in the west when I'd finished my stroll and found myself one more at the top of Gibbet Hill. The place was deserted now. The picnickers had all gone home. The pony traps and donkeys and parties of school children had disappeared, and nothing remained of the day's visitation but old newspapers and broken eggshells. The light was just beginning to fade and the air to grow a shade colder, and the sense of loneliness was more marked than ever. But you see, I had come from the midst of the hum and turmoil of the city to enjoy this very loneliness, and its luxury was to me unspeakable. Down in the valleys, the mist still lay, dim and fleecy white, and from it the hilltops rose, dark and grim. A belt of cloud fringed the whole horizon, and above it stretched a sea of sulphur yellow, flecked here and there with little clouds of white, which, swimming high above the level of the hill, caught the last splendours of the sun, now obscured by the horizon. One or two stars began to twinkle through the darkening sky, and a stillness that seemed sentient stole up through the valley and reached to where I sat. The air grew colder, and the silence became more perfect yet. The stars swam out into the sky, which had now a darker blue, and a soft light fell upon the whole scene. And I sat on, drinking in the wondrous beauty. Weariness of mind and body seemed to be of the dim past, as if they could never again be anything other than a sad memory. In such moments, a man seems almost to be born again and to have every faculty renewed to the full. I leaned with my back against the great stone cross, and putting my arms behind me, I clasped my arms round its back to change my position and enjoy more fully the luxury of rest. And then suddenly, without any warning, each of my hands was grasped from behind and held tight in a pair of hands, thin and warm, but so strong that I could not move. And at the same time, a scarf or a shawl of some light, fleecy, but thick material was thrown over my face and drawn tightly from behind, holding my head close to the stone. And then my hands were tied with a string around the wrists and drawn tight so that I was fixed more firmly than before. I could neither move nor speak. I could hear no sound, and I took it for granted that I was being prepared for robbery. I was alone, far away from anyone, in the hands of men far stronger than me, and I resigned myself to the situation as well as I could, secretly thankful that I only had a small amount of money on me. After a time which seemed long, but which was probably only a few minutes, the scarf was pulled down enough that my eyes were free, although my mouth was still covered, and I was unable to cry out. For a few moments, I was too surprised even to think it strange what I saw before me. In, Instead of burly footpads with rude manner and coarse force, were those three children. They stood before me, perfectly still and silent. And then two of them, the boy and one of the girls, smiled at me with an amused superiority, whilst the other girl, she who in the glade had exhibited such anger, sneered with a deadly cold hate which made me shudder, bound though I was. This girl now approached me, while the others remained quite still, looking on with their superior, amused smile. She then took from her waist, where it was concealed in the folds of her dress, a long, sharp dagger, thin, double-edged, and lethal-looking, which she proceeded to flourish before me with extraordinary dexterity and rapidity. Half the time, its keen edge actually touched my skin, and the contact made me wince. Anon, she would dart towards my eyes until I could actually feel its cold point touching my eyeballs. And then she began to hurl herself towards me, the point of the weapon directed to my heart. And then she would just stop, as it seemed that my last moment had come. Now, this went on only for a little while, but short though it was, it seemed endless. I now felt a cold chill, a strange numbness growing over me. My heart seemed to get cold and weak, colder and colder, weaker and weaker, till at length my eyes closed. I tried to open them, I succeeded, and then failed. I tried again, succeeded, failed, and at length consciousness passed away from me. The last thing that I remember seeing was the gleam of that long knife in the starlight as it moved in that young girl's hands. And the last sound that I heard was a low laugh from all three children. The voice in my ears was dim and distant, but it gradually grew louder and the words intelligible. Wake up! Come on, wake up, Nan! You'll catch your death of cold. Cold. The words struck home because there was at my heart a numbness and a chill as of death. My consciousness struggled back into existence and I opened my eyes. It was now much brighter because a great yellow moon had arisen and the common was flooded with its light. Beside me were two people whom I at once recognized as the honeymoon couple of earlier in the day. The man was bending over me, shaking me roughly by the shoulder, while the lady stood by, looking on anxiously with her hands clasped. He's not dead, is he, George? No, thank God. He must have fallen asleep. But it's a mercy you had the inspiration to come out here to see the moonlight view. You know, he might have died of cold if we hadn't found him. The ground is white already from the hoarfrost. Now, come on, wake up, man. You've got to wake up and come away. My heart, I murmured. My heart, because it was icy cold. The man frowned. Oh, gosh, Bella, this might be serious. Listen, could you run back to the hotel for help? I think his heart may be affected. Yes, of course, George dear, but shall I go now? No, wait just a moment. He leant over me again. Now, the past was coming very quickly back to me now, and so I said to him, did you see some children? Two Indian girls and a fair-haired boy. Yes, he said, hours ago. They were riding down the London road on a tricycle, laughing. I mean, we thought them the prettiest and happiest children we'd ever seen, didn't we? But why do you ask that? Oh, my heart! My heart! I cried out again because there was a coldness which was numbing me. The man put his hand over my heart and then quickly tore it away with a cry of terror. Ah! What is it, George? What's the matter? The lady almost shrieked because his action was so sudden and unexpected. The man stood back and she clung frightened to his arm. There's a huge snake, a blind worm, wriggled itself out of my bosom, fell on the ground, and glided away down the hillside into the copse below. And that concludes Gibbet Hill by Bram Stoker. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this, and if you enjoy this kind of thing, then please do consider becoming a patron of my YouTube channel, which you can do by, if you go to patreon.com and search for Robert Lloyd Parry, you'll find the appropriate page there and you can see what's on offer. Or you can make a one-off donation, if you like, using the PayPal button on the monkey.co.uk/contact page. But there's no obligation. I hope to see you again sometime, and I hope that you enjoyed Gibbet Hill.